Hi, everyone. Welcome to this evening's I Am public lecture, the first one of this academic year. My name is Vivian Howard, and I have the pleasure of being the acting director of the School of Information Management at Dalhousie. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. We also acknowledge the many contributions of the African Nova Scotian community, which has lived on this land for generations. I'd just like to cover a few brief housekeeping details. During the public lecture, if you have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat, which is on the right-hand side. You can do that at any point during the lecture. So if a question occurs to you, just add it to the chat right at the point that you think of it. When questions appear in the feed on the chat, you can upvote them by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. And the more thumbs up a question receives, the higher the priority the question will be given. And that helps to ensure that when the question period comes, that we ask the highest priority questions first, because we may not have a chance to get to all of the questions. If you would like closed captioning, there is a CC icon that you can click on to get the closed captioning. So those are the housekeeping details. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Anne Shaftel, who is a conservator and SIM adjunct faculty member. She is a fellow of the International Institute of Conservation, a fellow of the American Institute of Conservation, a member of Canadian Association of Professional Conservators, ICOM, and ICOMOS, and works internationally for archives, museums, universities, and monasteries. Since 1970, she has researched and taught in Asia, as well as extensive travel through the Middle East, Europe, and North America. Anne founded Treasure Caretaker Training, the award-winning preservation nonprofit. This evening, Anne will be speaking about traditional sacred texts and the art that makes them accessible. Traditional Buddhist texts in monasteries were inaccessible to diverse populations who had low literacy. Paintings, sculpture, music, and dance carried iconographic depictions from the texts to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. The relationship between texts and illustrative art is traditional and ongoing, even in today's digital universe. This presentation offers you a view into traditional Buddhist monastery archives and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Anne Shaftel.
Thank you, Vivian. Welcome to Dalhousie University School of Information, students, faculty, and staff. Welcome to our diverse international audience of archivists, scholars, curators, conservators, scientists. To those who live in monasteries and nunneries, those who practice meditation according to traditional texts and images, and to everyone concerned about preservation of traditional texts. Thank you to professional colleagues at SIM, especially Vivian, Sandra, and Kim, for bringing us together today. And appreciation for the support of my Treasure Caretaker training team. Thank you to scholars and translators, especially Georgie Bhutia, Jules Levinson, and Jigme Wangmo. Gratitude to our funders of many individual donors, and to our foundation donors, especially the Pema Chodron Foundation. In our time together today, let's look into the world of traditional Buddhist monastery archives. and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. Although I am academically trained with graduate degrees in history of art and conservation, most of the information for today's presentation comes from primary sources within monasteries from 1970s onwards. I'm so grateful to my Buddhist teachers for their generous advice and critique of our work. Thank you. Karmapas, 16th and 17th. Jamgon Khantrul, the 3rd and 4th. Kamtrul Rinpoches, 8th and 9th. Gelik Rinpoche, Trangur Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, Punlap Rinpoche, Mingyur Rinpoche, Ani Pema Chodron, and more. Thank you. Conservators and archivists work with cultural heritage treasures from diverse world religions, and the sacred adds deep complexity to our work. Are texts empowered by a separate ceremony, or are they sacred because of their contents? If a text has been unopened or disrespected for centuries, is it still sacred? Is the text itself sacred, or are the contents sacred? In the 21st century, if everything is digitized, what then is the status of a digital version of a sutra? Is the digital version sacred when it is on the website, or does it become sacred once it is printed? Our discussion today is imbued with respect for the sacred nature of text and illustrative artwork. Please feel free to bring this up in your questions and to access this video for further discussion on working with sacred art. Please also note that in our discussion today, the word text is used for sacred texts, as in the book form, as well as for the words contained within. Although I have researched and published widely on texts and tankas, I work in monasteries and communities for the preservation of all kinds of treasures. For example, these masks and dance costumes are tangible art forms used in performance of sacred dance. This is based on iconography that is lifted off the page from traditional texts. It brings the text alive for so many people. Part of my professional work is consultation for museums and archives on their tangible sacred art collections. I'm called in to work closely with staff for conservation examination and to document and design treatments and preservation parameters for Buddhist collections. My interest in Buddhist art began in museums in the 1950s. My second grade school class visited a museum and we looked at their beautiful Buddhist cultural display. That museum's now one of my clients. I also work with our nonprofit. Treasure Caretaker Training is a nonprofit organization dedicated to working closely with monks and nuns for preservation of Buddhist treasures in monasteries and communities. Preservation workshops in monasteries are ongoing in Nepal, Bhutan, and India, as well as in Western universities and Dharma centers. Monastics who have trained with us early on are now senior in their monasteries and are teaching preservation measures to others and teaching in our workshops. I often receive online questions from monks and nuns in remote monasteries, as well as from professional colleagues who are concerned about specific preservation situations. That's why we created an online preservation resource to provide practical and low-cost solutions for monasteries and their communities. The Preservation of Buddhist Treasures resource is free online It's a reference with practical information for the preservation of texts, tankas, and other forms of Buddhist sacred art. It is written in direct response to questions asked by monastics and illustrated with images from their own monasteries. All chapters have been reviewed by our Buddhist teachers, scholars, scientists, conservators, archivists, and monks and nuns, and are available currently in Hindi and Mandarin, with Nepali and Tibetan translations coming up soon. Our preservation workshops within monasteries are really popular, with active participation, especially in our risk assessment and other activities. For more information on risk assessment in monasteries and their communities, you may enjoy this presentation done with Buddhist Store Global. Safer storage for both archives, museums, and within monasteries for texts and sacred art treasures is not just about security. We offer redesign of existing monastery storage areas, as well as creating new ones. We share video interview techniques with our workshop participants and encourage them to add video to their digital documentation files. We want them to document the stories about monastery treasures that only the elders and retired caretakers remember. This can be significant in the event of a theft or in the event of a natural disaster. Documentation. In order to preserve traditional and evolving sacred art treasures, documentation and technical information are crucial so as to protect them in collaboration with this generation and share them with coming generations. In this image, you can see our workshop participants, archivists, scholars, monks and nuns, practicing documentation in one of our treasure caretaker training workshops. Here they're documenting on site in a large Buddhist temple with texts, tankas, and paintings. Those are some of our participants working really hard. Here, they're working in a team to document the condition of a traditional text. All of our activities are done in teams. In our workshop, each team presents its documentation in front of the entire participant group for their critique. So what were they documenting? Here's an example of a traditional text. Easy to pack up for travel on your favorite yak or your favorite pony. This is a traditional text in use by a Buddhist nun. It has been printed by traditional woodblock process. And please note that the image that illustrates the iconography described in the text is part of it. This is a complete form of a traditional text, although not all Buddhist texts look like this these days. And there's a text all wrapped up, similar to the diagram, in a tanka painting. If you're a Western archivist watching this and are interested in traditional Buddhist texts, you might be able to find them in your local Buddhist center or in your university library. Texts are usually wrapped in cloth, even in storage on shelves. They are unwrapped for use and then wrapped again after use. This is a very traditional way to do it, almost formulaic. Archival type book boxes are being created and used these days. And all the archivists watching this will like that. Well labeled. This is a very valuable family heirloom text that was owned by a master painter of Buddhist iconography, Rinzin Rongge. He was my Buddhist painting teacher in 1977. Although traditional texts are created from differing methods and materials according to geography and style, they are all subject to certain categories of damage. Texts are found to be stained and darkened with oil from fingers turning the pages. Butter lamp smoke and incense grit mixture was used as respectful offerings and found in temples. The pages are vulnerable to fraying around the edges and very vulnerable to insect activity. This traditional-looking text was sold to a tourist as an authentic antique monastery treasure for a lot of money. Some scholars are determining that it is a fake, made for sale to tourists as an antique. If this is so, the aging and areas of usage and darkening on the paper has been created intentionally. What do you think about this text? In the gar or tent culture that developed in the Himalayan region, entire monasteries traveled extensively to outlying areas in order to spread the teachings of the Buddha. Everything they needed and used traveled on the backs of yaks and ponies, including tents, furniture, texts, and paintings. Thangkas, for example, evolved from the long history of scroll paintings and from this nomadic lifestyle of early Buddhist monasteries. Yak hide glue, highly distilled, was the traditional binder for earth pigments in most historic traditional artwork. Traditional Buddhist texts, such as those studied and practiced in monasteries, were for the most part beyond the reach of the many and diverse people of Himalayan Buddhism, few of whom knew how to read. Moreover, scholars who lived far from the centers of education, often at great remove along the Silk Road and elsewhere, had little access through the profound texts that were held by these distant monasteries. Painting, sculpture, music, and dance carried iconographic depictions from text to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. The relationship between text and illustrative art is traditional and ongoing, even in today's digital universe. Let's look into the world of traditional Buddhist monastery archives, those in community temples too, and the changing art forms that continue to illustrate sacred texts. For example, in this community Buddhist temple in Shanghai, beautiful calligraphies of Buddhist sutras have a place of honor on their shrine. Within a monastery, traditional texts are given a place of honor. Here in this monastery, you see texts behind glass in the bookshelves, statues, tankas, chevrons. And for this Zoom, many of you joining here, well, you may visit monasteries often, or perhaps you actually live in a monastery. But there are also people watching who have never visited a monastery at all. They've never been in a monastery and are now just learning about Buddhism. so bear with us. Texts are worthy of respect, and respect is shown to them. The Kanjur texts especially are considered words of the Buddha. Here, the Kanjur text is carried respectfully in a yearly procession. The monks on the right are offering flowers to the knowledge and blessing contained within the text, as well as to the actual physical texts. Traditional texts here are located in a prominent archive in Sikkim, Namgyal Institute. They're available for scholars and monastic researchers. You can go there. The texts are shelved and displayed respectfully. Namgyal Institute is a place I have worked several times, conducting conservation assessment, documenting the Tanka collection, and teaching 2 preservation of monastery treasures workshops for monks, nuns, archivists, scholars, artists, police, military, and others. Please join us in one. The archive is dignified and beautifully maintained with low light levels. The archive has its own traditional shrine with offerings. And the staff work in beautiful surroundings. However, in other libraries located throughout the Buddhist world, there are not enough resources to preserve the original precious texts, and funds are going only towards digitization. Within monasteries, texts are considered very valuable treasures, but very vulnerable, mostly for the Buddhist teachings they contain. This monastery, located in the mountains around Kathmandu, was so damaged in the earthquake that the main shrine hall was demolished. Important texts were salvaged and kept in a shrine hall in another building until the new Lachang temple was built. This is a statue of the representation of wisdom or knowledge, Manjushri, and a painting with Manjushri. Both hold a flower, supporting a traditional text. The historical figure in this Tanka painting is holding a traditional text, unwrapped and ready for you to read. This painting shows the traditional books all wrapped up with labels to identify them. These are paintings from Tankas. The relationship between text and illustrative art is again traditional and ongoing. When many people think of Buddhist art, they often are thinking of Tankas, prominent in museums and considered very collectible on the international art market. A Tanka is a Buddhist religious object in the form of a scroll. There's the central iconographic panel set into a textile mounting. If you're interested in Tankas, for more information, you can access this webinar. A great meditation master who's also a master painter is a rare combination. In this case, the 17th Karmapa has both figurative image and text in his own painting of Padmasambhava. Some Tankas have writing on the front and on the back, including and in addition to the empowerment syllables. Through the science of light, we can make visible the elements of texts and iconography that have been damaged. And we're able to do so without harming the original. If letters have become indistinct, it's possible to make them visible again in digital form. Our enhanced image helped with the translation. Often, text on the reverse of paintings is beautifully done. These are examples of fragile gold text and our work with post-capture apps to make the text visible again. We also use these techniques on original books and traditional texts. You might find it useful. Through centuries, tankas have carried iconographic depictions from texts to serve as a guide to meditation and visualization. Here's a recent example. The well-respected scholar and meditation master Dorjigchen Rinpoche in Sikkim had in his personal archives a Buddhist lineage text that he wanted to teach from and to share with as many people as possible for their benefit. Rinpoche realized that more people look at paintings and statues than those that can, or have the Tibetan language skills, or the time to read long traditional Tibetan texts. It is possible, actually, that this has been true for centuries. Thus, Rinpoche hired a contemporary tanka painting master to illustrate his traditional Tibetan language text. The master painter, who's on our Treasure Caretaker training team, lived in the monastery and painted illustrations for the text, working closely with Dorjigchen Rinpoche to be sure that the iconography reflected accurately what the text described. This continues on a centuries-old tradition, from master painters in the past to our current time. Most painting masters had apprentices, and thus many historic paintings are actually workshop productions. Well, as are the great master painters. For example, Michelangelo was largely workshop produced. This master painter, Tsering Kelsang, is quite accomplished and sometimes works alone, like in the monastery, but also has a workshop. Because Dorjigchen Rinpoche is elderly, and out of respect and devotion, the artist wanted to include him in the tanka, so future generations will know what he looked like after he passes away. Although in person he is humble and dresses simply, the artist has idealized the image. He's depicted without his eyeglasses and surrounded by a lot of brocade. That's how he will be viewed in the future. Tsering Kelsang moved into the monastery for 3 years to illustrate the text. The Buddhist meditation master and the painting master worked closely together so that every detail of the text was depicted in tanka form. This was an entire lineage text that had never been illustrated to this extent. Dorjigchen Rinpoche also realized that these days more people could see tankas in the form of digital reproductions than would be able to actually see the original paintings created by the master painter. How many of us could visit this beautiful monastery in Sikkim, especially these days? So when the paintings were completed, they were photographed before they were sewn into traditional textile mountings. The prints are for sale in the monastery shop. Let's visit the monastery in Sikkim, and this is the monastery shop. Within the monastery shop, the text and illustrations created especially for the text are for sale to pilgrims, scholars, monastics, householders, and some tourists if they've received the initiations. This is a digital copy of the original sacred text that was in the archives of the Egyptian Rinpoche. Here is a page of the text with a painting that illustrates the iconography described on it. The Thangka reproductions are blessed, and the iconography is accurate. These are some of the reproductions. The prints are for sale, along with the text, and the painter made a point of telling me about a monk who purchased the reproduction text, but every single print, because he had received empowerment and it had become his main meditation practice. The reproductions are all over the monk's room in his monastery, and the text is on his puja table. This is his practice. Change in illustrative art form is a constant. Part and parcel of traditional societies, traditional knowledge is usually given by one person to another. However, things are changing. With the openness of the internet affording even remote members of traditional societies the opportunity to see the whole world. There's a change in the availability of traditional methods and materials. Statues, for example, formerly cast metal alloy and mercury gilded, are now found to be cast synthetic compound and plastic. These images, these statues, are located in a monastery, and they are all equally blessed. As with text and painted illustrations of it, copying's within the tradition. And it's all according to traditional methods and materials, cultural influence, but what's available now and changing cultural influences. For example, this is the third Karmapa Ranjan Dorje, his face traditionally appearing in the moon. First on a traditional woodblock print. Next, on a wall painting in Rimtek Monastery in Sikkim, and now as a newly created Thangka. Yes, even digital art forms. This example of the representation of a teacher is done with devotion and used in monasteries. Texts are inventoried in a monastery and are being actively digitized, as we mentioned. In Delhi in 1970, I met the esteemed Jean Smith, a pioneer in preservation of Buddhist texts from all lineages. Now, private foundations and universities are interested, and texts are being actively digitized everywhere. There's a significant amount of funding for digitizing Buddhist texts, and with good reason, of course. The originals are impermanent. Impermanence is fundamental to the Buddhist understanding of life and death. And the knowledge and blessings contained within the text is being secured for future generations.
For one image, it's like 200 or 200 MB, sometimes it goes to 500 MB. I think that is too much, too big. So it will bring problem to our storage system. We have to, exchanging, we have to buy more. That's why
It's very high quality, but then you can do much with it.
But I think it is that's good quality, so that we can read and we can also keep it for a long time. So I will explain again.
That's in India. Handwritten and hand-printed books have changed in form to machine-printed, and now they can be digitally scanned and accessed. Sacred texts can have a vastly wider audience. This is similar to the wider audience that tankas and other forms of art that illustrate the texts now have when shared as digital images. You can find out more about what we discussed today on our website. Thank you so much for your interest. And I so look forward to a lively discussion from your own experiences. If there's not enough time for you to discuss in person today, please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a fascinating lecture, and those visuals were absolutely breathtaking. But I know we do have some questions, and if you have more questions, please keep adding them to the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can. We've got about 25 minutes for questions. So the first question for you, Anne, is what is your most vivid or impactful memory working with sacred and traditional texts? Or alternatively, something you wish to share that the audience would find surprising about working with traditional Buddhist texts?
First, could I request that on my screen I can see people instead of my own image? I'm still looking at my slideshow, and I'd love to see who's asking.
And I think you need to you have to close your slides in order for you to see it in Teams.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Could you ask that again, please?
Sure. So you're
Hello,
only going to...
everybody.
Yeah. Hi, Anne. You're only going to see me, Anne, because it doesn't allow you to see the whole audience, but I will be your intermediary with the audience.
Thank you. Vivian, you'll do.
Okay.
You're good.
Thank you.
Okay.
So the first question is, what is your most vivid or impactful memory working with sacred or traditional texts? Or alternatively, is there something you wish to share that the audience would find surprising about working with these traditional Buddhist texts?
I once visited the site of a fire where an entire monastery had burned down because of poor electrical wiring. And all of the texts burned up. And I remember walking, I have visual images of this, which I didn't show today, but I remember walking through the ruins and knowing that not many of those texts had been digitized yet, and feeling heartbroken about that. And then a really inspiring memory. In 2005, I was teaching a preservation of monastery treasures workshop in Bhutan, and we did a tour of monasteries, traditional monasteries. One of the participants was a high-ranking monk, and we went into the storage room of a monastery. And there was a plain storage cabinet, which would just look like a metal cabinet with, a lock, and it wasn't fancy. And that was that way to keep insects and monkeys out, of course. And so he bowed down to it, and he put his head against the outside of the cabinet. And for the longest time, his head was against the outside of the cabinet, and he was praying. And he was bowing to the sacred texts that were within the cabinet. That's how much respect he had. That really made an impression on me about the subtlety of working with the sacred.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Anne. Just a very quick follow-up question. What is the oldest sacred text that you've ever worked with?
I can't really say that because when I work in monasteries, it's completely confidential. And that's the basis of it. Plus, when I advise on storage and handling, etc., I'm not asking how old the texts are, because the indication of value by age or the subject is not within the purview of a conservator. I only want to be of service to the monks or nuns or archivists, museum people, community members, and it's not for me to make a judgment about value in terms of age or what the market says it's worth or what the subject matter is. So usually I prefer not to ask. I would prefer if they bring it up, and they do, if they want my opinion on something. And this is fundamental to working within a monastery, is the respect for confidentiality.
That's fascinating. So the age would not actually be part of the archival description.
The archival description in a monastery is where it's located.
Okay.
That's the sum total, what it is and where it's located. The type of documentation that you as a super great archivist have and that you teach your participants and students doesn't exist. It's beginning now, and it's beginning first with texts and then secondary with sacred art that illustrates the text, like tankas and statues. However, still, at this point, more funding is going into digitization of texts than in preservation of the originals. And of course, I know I completely understand digitization, but I definitely feel that the originals are so important. For one thing, they carry blessings.
That's fascinating. And the next question, I think it ties in very much, or is a good segue from what you were just saying, and that is, has the drive to digitize affected the integrity of sacred texts in terms of document damage, or has digitization helped preserve artifacts which may have been too fragile to share without modern methods of sharing?
Certainly, if the sacred teachings within a text are disappearing because the text itself is falling apart, like the one I showed you where insects had eaten it, silverfish, it's so important to preserve it. I mean, traditionally, it would have been copied. For example, I showed you two tankas, one older, one new, with the same Amitayas main figure. And also texts were copied, wood blocks were cut, and texts were shared. That's how they traveled on the yaks. That's how you learned. You would get a copy of a text, especially for your own practice. But there are many that were not shared for certain reasons and for various reasons. Either well, they've been within one lineage, for example, or you, Livian, have not received the empowerment to read that text. And in terms of anything, so copying is within the tradition. So digitization, in a way, is not outside of the tradition. It's just another way of copying, isn't it? However, in terms of whether damage is done to the originals during the digitization, that depends, of course, on the skill of the technician, and also on how much light is used and how they're handled, but also, how that text is shared. For example, a lot of these texts were not meant to be shared. This is really important. So just because there's a digital copy doesn't mean that it goes on the World Wide Web for everyone to read.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And the next question is about that the market. And you mentioned that occasionally these texts end up on the international art market. So, is there an underground market for sacred and traditional texts? And, how does a text go from, a home in a monastery or an archive in a monastery to that art market?
I just recently did a presentation on theft from monasteries, which I'm sorry I didn't reference here. It was for the Indira Gandhi Center in Delhi. And we talked about theft from monasteries. And of course, there's a market for everything. And tankas, statues, texts, they are stolen from monasteries, unfortunately. And there are buyers for them.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up part of that question is, has the impact of COVID changed that underground market? Has it increased interest, decreased interest? Has there been any impact of COVID?
I'm going to be really careful answering this. For one thing, monasteries are more on lockdown. So there are fewer tourists coming in and out and fewer visitors. So that helps.
Mm-hmm.
So let's leave it at that. I think that that's been a positive thing in a way, because sometimes, for example, during certain celebrations of the year according to the lunar calendar, there's so many pilgrims and tourists and community members and monks and nuns from other areas that come through monastery that things can disappear because it's hard to keep track. But the lockdown has in a way been good. I mean, it has allowed a lot more time for internal housekeeping and a lot more time for pujas and prayers, especially prayers dedicated to the well-being of others who are suffering.
That's very interesting. I've just got a very sort of practical question about the texts. Are they concertina folded?
No.
No.
You flip the pages.
Okay.
Yeah, and put it down.
There's no folds in them.
No, they're individual pages.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So you would front and back, so you turn it. That's why they have to be well wrapped, because otherwise, with a strong wind, they would just blow all over the shrine room. They're not connected to each other.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And that largely has to do with the printing process. With the size of a woodblock. Okay. Carve, print.
Carve and print. And you mentioned, there has been some change of technology, that some of the sacred texts are now machine printed. Are any sacred texts created as digital originals, or are they all created as analog originals that then become digitized?
I actually love that question. Is that your question, Vivian?
It is.
Okay. It's a great question. And the thing is that we're not talking about far history. We're talking about a living religion and a living culture. So therefore, there's some very compassionate and powerful teachers who are living today. And they create teachings from their own inspiration, from their own meditation practice, influenced by their lineage. And therefore, what they create as a text of a practice, for example, would perhaps go directly to their computer. So there would be no analog involved unless they wish to write it down. And then their secretary might put it on the computer. But so many of the compassionate and brilliant teachers today, young or old, are going directly to computer. with their texts.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a living religion.
Yeah, and not surprising that technology, marches on. And one question that I think is connected here is whether the digital copies of texts have any different sacred significance compared to the original, or simply compared to an analog sacred text. Are they basically interchangeable, I guess?
I know that was one of the questions I posed in the beginning, but it's not for me to answer that, because teachers I have asked about that, and I've been interviewing Buddhist teachers since 1970. That's a substantial number of years on questions just like this. There are different responses. Whether we're asking this about the form of a traditional text and now it's digital, or whether we're asking about a Thangka painting and now it's accessible digitally. And so there are actually quite a few opinions on that. It's not for me to summarize. It would be very superficial. But the discussion about that is quite fascinating. And there are different points of view, from elderly traditional teachers to younger teachers. And the discussion is actually more subtle and nuanced than one would imagine.
That is very, very interesting. Yeah, there could be a whole talk just on that question alone. It's fascinating. I know, very much challenged by my bad pronunciation, so please forgive me. I will try to do my best, but here's the question. Did pratitya samuptata, or dependent arising, and the three universal truths inform your treatment choices? And then in parentheses, number 1, everything is impermanent and changing. Number 2, impermanence leads to suffering, making life imperfect. And number 3, the life is not, or the self is not personal and unchanging.
Well, Vivian, the fact is that I was Buddhist before I became a conservator. So whereas a lot of my colleagues, they became conservators and became head of the labs, and then they became interested in mindfulness meditation, then got some Buddhist teachings, and in their collection there's a Thangka or two or a text. Actually, I was Buddhist before, and through the years, I've always asked my Buddhist teachers about how to approach my professional work with those in mind. So to be quite honest, I think about them often, because conservators and archivists want to make everything last forever. We're eternalists. And in Buddhism, you get the eternalism versus nihilism, and they're opposite. And neither is the middle way. And the middle way perhaps is a good way to approach it.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because I mean, definitely, what we are taught is to to take the ephemeral and to try to preserve the ephemeral so that it becomes more long lasting. But the view of what is ephemeral is a cultural construct as well. So that's very interesting. This is a very big question. What are the great principles that you applied while conserving sacred texts? I don't know if there's an easy answer to that question. It's a big one.
I work closely with teachers in their monasteries and sometimes on their texts. And I am at their service. I mean, I'm just a guest. I'm a guest in the culture. I'm a guest with all my science. I come loaded with all this science. And all the latest diagnostic tools that my friends, the scientists, make available to me. And everything I teach is science-based. And when I work in a museum, it's all science. And perhaps on the edge, we have to respect the culture. There's the sense that, oh yes, we have to respect the culture. So again, I definitely stick to my ethics. I stick to my ethics as a person, as a Buddhist, and as a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
I stay in the middle, and that's the best way to do it. Because I work in such diverse circumstances with texts and for diverse clients.
Yeah, it definitely struck me as you were talking how important that cultural, I mean, certainly respect, is critical, but more than respect, just that appreciation and understanding is critical, that you couldn't really do the work you do without having that. It would make it almost impossible to have the kind of access and the kind of communication that you do.
Perhaps someday you and some of the department students would like to come with me to one of those workshops in a monastery.
That'd be fascinating.
I think they would have a lot to offer, and we would all learn a lot. I look forward to that. And
maybe, we're almost out of time, so maybe just as a final question, these are, such incredibly visually, gorgeous examples that you've showed us here. Is there anywhere in Halifax where people can see original works, or is there no publicly accessible collection that people would be able to see?
There's a Buddhist monastery on Yonge Avenue called Karma Changchip Ling. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Shambhala Center, and both have a lot of art and texts, both. And they welcome community and scholars. I'd say in almost every city you could find one. People are welcome, according to COVID regulations, of course. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're all welcome. And you're welcome to contact me if you have further questions. I've really enjoyed our time together today.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne. And that is, excellent intelligence about where in Halifax people who want to follow up and see some of these examples firsthand, that they are in fact available. And we do have a rich Buddhist culture in Halifax that continues to thrive. So I think I will just draw this to a close by, again, thanking Anne so much for her presentation, and thanking you all for joining us today. I hope you have a good evening, and please look out for announcements of our next public lecture, which will be featuring Raymond Frogner, Head Archivist of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg. That's coming up, I believe, on November the 1st, and will also be another virtual presentation. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye now.